What they said was the prosecution didn't prove that she killed her child, and that's the way the system has to be. You formulate opinions all the time, reading the newspaper as to whether somebody killed somebody or not, but you also read all the time in the newspaper about people who are exonerated. In fact, you may have read in the last couple of days the West Memphis Three people convicted when they were in their teens of murdering 3 young boys. There was a false confession from one on a boy who had some mental problems, and now it turns out that they aren't guilty at all. They've served 17 years in prison. Well, I'm sure the media hyped that up and convicted these boys before they ever had a chance to really defend themselves, and now it turns out they're innocent. The one that scares me the most in the presidential race, Rick Perry, he had an execution in Texas, was pointed out to him that they executed an innocent man, and of course his reaction, instead of saying, we'll implement policies and procedures to make sure it doesn't happen again, he says, well, mistakes happen. Well, you know, those aren't the types of mistakes we want to have happen in society. We don't want innocent people going to prison or being put to death because we think they're guilty. We need to prove they're guilty, and when the people fail to prove guilt, the only just verdict and the only way society can remain free is if the verdict is not guilty. So, again, the result is likely to be wrong, but the verdict was correct.
Thank you. Well, in view of the fact that statistically I think there is over 650 people have been executed who did not commit the crime, and they found out much later. And that recent Texas one, they actually said, we know from DNA it wasn't him.
That's correct.
And we want you to hold off on this until we can prove it.
And they didn't.
Lots of calls coming. You want to take a call? Good morning, caller.
Happy to.
Good morning, caller. Thank you for waiting.
Good morning.
Good morning, Reed. How are you?
Fine.
Good morning.
My question is regarding taxes. I'm curious, which taxes do seniors have to pay, and which ones are they exempt from, or can they receive exempt from?
They're not really exempt from any. There are exemptions that allow, for example, in property taxes, you get reductions in them, you get extra, it's called enhanced star, you get some breaks that way. But if your income is sufficient, you have to pay income tax still, both state and federal. You have to pay sales tax. There's really no exemptions. They just raise the monetary threshold at which point you have to pay taxes. If, for example, you have a $500,000 house on Chautauqua Lake, it doesn't matter that you're 1,000 years old, you're still going to have to pay property taxes on it, although not at the level that somebody who was not a senior or who was not a veteran would pay. There are exemptions for veterans, there are exemptions for seniors, they're income-based. So if your house is $500,000 but you have no income, you're going to get some reductions from it. They're called exemptions, but it's really not an exemption from the tax. It's an exemption from a portion of the tax that's imposed.
And also, caller, if you're blind, you do get a break on your income taxes. And if you are over a certain age, I think, and working, they will give you a break on that against your Social Security. But
correct.
There are very few. The breaks are very few and far between, and very, very small, right?
Yes, there are. Now, for example, there are state pensions. There's no state tax on state pensions, but there's federal tax and there's Social Security or FICA on state pensions. So I'm a senior, and I have to pay taxes still, and I expect, hopefully for a lot longer, I'll continue to pay taxes. Yeah, and not that I like paying taxes, the lot longer was the key there.
The state charges you taxes on your Social Security.
They do.
The federal does not. Or they may be shortly. They're going to means test your Social Security shortly.
Yeah, that's your money they took, and then they're charging you tax. But that, nonetheless, they've got to solve the system. But I agree with you, Reed. Your statement at the beginning, it looks like they're trying to balance the budget, mostly on the backs of seniors by cutting the entitlements. What they don't seem to recognize is the money in those programs is money they took from us once before. Yeah. You paid Social Security.
With a contract. They're breaking the contract.
That's essentially correct. And the problem is, of course, because they borrowed it all, they took the money that they set aside. Had they put that money aside, as they said they were doing, the money would be there.
$8 trillion.
Yeah, it would be there into perpetuity because, but it's not because they
stole it.
They did.
Basically, the so-called trust fund. Don't trust Congress any further than you can.
I don't. I'll tell you what. I'm very
disappointed. They wiped it out. They wiped it out. There's nothing there except a big IOU, which they cannot possibly pay back. Although we should confiscate all their salaries.
Now, one of the things that kind of bothers me, and I know there's no new taxes at all, but why is it that there's always a threshold as to how much Social Security is taken from you. In other words, there's an income threshold. You get to a certain level, they no longer take it.
No, the rich and powerful don't have to pay much.
That doesn't make sense to me. The income taxes are based upon your income. Why are not FICA and Medicare, well, I guess Medicare is, but why isn't FICA also based upon your income? In other words, I'll be the first one to admit, I always hit the maximum and I stop paying tax after a certain point. And is that good? Well, nobody likes to pay taxes. I'll be the first one to admit that. But by the same token, why is it fair that I can continue to work and earn money and I don't have to pay that 5.65%?
And they do right up to the end. Actually, between your Social Security and your FICA and your donation from the employer for your Social Security,
Right.
which might have gone to you, the average tax on people, the average person is running 40 to 45%, not counting New York State, which bites the hell out of you. And then the average billionaire, multimillionaire, since he gets most of his income from tax-exempt dividends, capital gains, and so forth, pays 12%. There's something wrong with this picture, especially when only 1% of these folks own 90% of all the wealth in this country.
And then you read about some of them that don't pay any taxes at all or pay less tax than their workers do, which makes a lot of sense. Their workers are making $50,000, they're making $500 million, and they pay less tax than the person who's making $50,000. That's patently unfair, and Congress and the Tea Partiers, as a matter of fact, need to be told that there are some circumstances where taxes need to be raised. They don't need to be raised on the middle class, they don't need to be raised on the working poor, they don't need to be raised in property taxes, they need to be raised on people who aren't paying their fair share.
Exactly.
And what's wrong with that? Why do we have to support them? They can support themselves many times over. It makes no sense.
Yeah, and they keep telling us, well, we're not going to raise taxes on our poor, hard-earning people.
But they do.
But they're not raising taxes on the poor, hard-earning people. These tax bills are for the rich. That's the hell of it.
Yeah, to see the problem with that theory is when they cut all these programs, that increases your property taxes. And of course, I'm not in a position where I get the exemption from property taxes. So in a sense, even though my income tax rates may not have gone up this past year, and maybe they won't go up again next year, my tax burden has gone up.
And they've gone up on the state, local, and federal level. Caller, good morning. Thank you for
Good
waiting.
morning. Sorry to have
Good
to
morning. Good morning. I was curious, Jim. When you're watching TV nowadays, they show so much about the crime that's committed, the way the lawyers approach the cases and stuff. Is this a healthy thing for our society today?
I don't think it is. And like I said, and it breeds the Nancy Graces of the world who think they have the solution to it all. They have a bully pulpit and they try to sway public opinion to a certain viewpoint. And I think that's absolutely wrong. Criminal cases are very complex. I mean, a speeding ticket isn't real complex, but that's not a criminal case. Homicides are very complex things, and they're getting more complex all the time. I used to try probably 2 murders a year, and each of those trials was 4 weeks long. The preparation form was at least twice that for each one. That's how difficult it is. You don't have time to be espousing your theories before the public to sway public opinion one way or another. Now, some of the criminal defendants are really despicable people, and most of the criminal defendants have done really despicable things. But you don't go and parade in front of a camera or to a newspaper and say, this is what's happened, this is what we're going to do about it. You have to be very circumspect when you deal with the media, and it needs to be. Now, I understand that trials need to be public, and there's going to be coverage from it, and newspapers if they want, and television and radio stations if they want, can sit through the proceedings and listen to them to tell what the evidence is, and maybe even go so far as to have a legal commentator on and say, this is what the evidence was, this is why it was presented, and this is what its impact may be. But to go beyond that, I think, is doing a disservice. But I think, and this is a personal opinion, we've gone way too far with reality shows that aren't reality at all. I mean, some of the schlock that's on TV now, but that includes the shows dealing with legal issues. And, I mean, for example, I think it was tragic that, and she would have been 21, I just saw it, JonBenet Ramsey, when she was kidnapped, raped, and murdered. She was 7 years old in Colorado. My God, you think that was the only thing that happened? The only thing the TV stations cover more are royal weddings, which I think are really...
Well, that's it. We're getting a lot of nice trivia. We're not concentrating on the wars that
That's
are
right.
bleeding us white, the Congress wasteful spending and new taxes and everything. We have, and it's like during the Roman days when the Romans had an iron hand on everybody and they were bleeding them dry. They gave them entertainment. They had the Colosseum and they let them watch them kill people
Yeah,
there with
and then
animals.
let lions kill them. And,
Right, right. And that was their entertainment. It's like football today, incidentally.
well, in a sense, yeah. Not a lot of people die in football.
But it's a grand entertainment, this big production every week. And
No, I think we've gone way too far, and I realize we're daily improving media. I'm still not giving in to the smartphones. I only have a phone that has a keyboard on it because my children text rather than call most of the time, so I need the keyboard to text back. But I want a cell phone only because I need to, on some occasions, when I'm not near a phone, be able to make a telephone call.
Me too.
And my kids, smartphones, they can do anything. I don't want that.
it's a computer in hand.
It
It's
is. That's
amazing.
exactly what it
And
is.
With the Wii, or the Wi-Fi, they got everything. I mean, these guys.
Technology is improving daily, and I can understand how we get these things more simultaneously than we ever did in the past. But I think there's got to be a limit on the discretion that news organizations, newspapers use, and then, of course, networks use for purposes of entertainment, for titillating their public. I mean, no.
And
News is
propaganda.
that's right. News is news.
Yeah.
And we're entitled to know the news. I'd like to know the news honestly. I'd like to have it reported as to what actually occurred, as to somebody giving their opinion. If I want an opinion, I'll read the op-ed pages, or I'll go on the internet and read the op-ed pages there. If I want an opinion, I'll ask somebody their opinion. But I want news. I don't want somebody telling me that this person is guilty, that person is wrong, this person needs to be executed. That's not our function.
A lot of the media, most of the media, especially television, is owned by the giant corporations. Now, the rich and powerful control your thoughts even.
And they're trying to make
your
more money, of
information.
course.
And of course, and on top of that, of course, they want to brainwash you, make you forget what they're doing to the American public today. Jim Subjack is our guest. He's an attorney. He does a lot with labor law, and he's very conversant in all sorts of things going on. We had talked briefly about Nushan Williams. Now, what do you think of the fact that he served his time, but they're going to keep him in jail anyway?
Well, they're not actually keeping him in jail, or at least that's what they don't call it anymore. It's called civil confinement. That's a law which, by the way, has been deemed to be constitutional and legal, where an evaluation is done for a sexual predator. And I'm actually very happy this happened, but one of the crimes I convicted him of when I was DA was a rape offense, because one of his victims, at the time that he had sex with her, was 13 years old.
Unbelievable. And he infected her,
Oh,
probably.
of course,
Yep.
he did. So what happened is you got him having sex with a 13-year-old girl, which is a rape in New York State, should be a rape in New York State and everywhere else. So because we had him for the rape conviction, he's a sexual predator. Now keep in mind the spread of HIV to other victims, even though transmitted by a sexual act, doesn't make him a sexual predator. So fortunately we had that rape conviction, which then makes him a sexual predator. Under New York state law now, when you are this sexual predator, they have a right, and in fact an obligation, to do an evaluation of the individual before he or she is released from custody to determine whether or not that sexual predation instinct or tendency is still there. They actually had a hearing. The judge in Buffalo that conducted the hearing is a very, very experienced judge. That's pretty much all he does up in Erie County is handle the sexual offenses there. He's very fair. He's very knowledgeable. He listened to the evidence. He heard the evaluations. He listened to medical proof. And it was his determination that Nushan Williams needs to be confined civilly. He's no longer a prisoner serving a state sentence. However, he's in civil confinement, not because he's being...
What does that mean, civil confinement?
Well, it's essentially being in jail. But what it is instead of him being behind bars because he was sentenced and that's his punishment, he's now being confined for purposes of safety of the public. It's been deemed after a hearing. Again, this isn't a decision that's snap made and subject to no appeal. After a full hearing, it was decided that Williams is still a threat to anyone to whom he may have contact after he's out. Now, I know there's a movement to stray away from big government, but I don't think one of the functions of government that we should abandon has ever been the protection of its citizens. So if we